somewhere in the ancient dust of southern Iraq, a scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded the end of the world. Not a flood, not a war, not a plague. Something far stranger and far more deliberate. He wrote about gods who looked back at their temples one final time, said something to the people who had served them for thousands of years, and then simply left. The scribe's words survived. The gods did not. And the question that has haunted scholars, researchers, and anyone willing to look closely at this text is not how a civilization fell apart. The question is why the beings who built it chose to walk away, and what exactly they said before they did. If you're ready to sit with one of history's most unsettling mysteries, you're in exactly the right place. And you might want to stay until the very end, because the deeper you go into this story, the less comfortable it gets. The city of Aridu. That is where this begins. Located in what is now the barren, windswept south of Iraq, a place of cracked earth and searing heat. Aridu is considered by historians to be the oldest city in Sumer, possibly the oldest city in the entire world. Founded somewhere around 5,400 BCE. It sits like a wound in the landscape, a tell of collapsed mud brick rising from a dead plain. But according to the Sumerians themselves, Aridu was not merely their oldest city. It was the city, the first place on earth where kingship descended from the heavens. The place the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest documents ever discovered, begins its accounting of rulers with a single, impossible claim. That the first king of Aridu, a man named Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. And yet, that claim is written in the same matter-of-fact administrative tone as any other entry. No fanfare, no mythology, just a number, just a fact. As if ruling for 28,000 years were perfectly ordinary. What would it take to make ordinary people write something like that? And why does every scholar who encounters that text look away a little too quickly? Here's where it gets strange. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on what is known as the Weld Blundell Prism, a clay object currently housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, records 8 kings before a catastrophic flood. And 8 kings whose combined reigns total 241,200 years. Mainstream historians call this mythological, symbolic, an exaggeration of memory. That's possible. But consider this. The same document that records those impossible reigns also lists post-flood kings whose reigns are short, verifiable, and match independently confirmed archaeological dates almost perfectly. Why would the same document be reliably accurate about everything after the flood, and yet wildly fantastical about everything before it? What if it isn't a myth at all? What if the people who wrote it simply recorded what they had been told? Faithfully, literally, without embellishment. And the problem isn't with their document, but with our unwillingness to ask what those numbers might actually mean. But that is only the beginning of what the Sumerians left behind. Because there is another text, a text that was composed not to celebrate the gods, Asasurum, but to describe the moment they stopped protecting humanity. A text that uses language so raw, so specific, and so unnervingly personal that even the academics who study it admit it reads less like poetry and more like a wound. It is called the Lament for Sumer and Ur, and it was set down in cuneiform on clay tablets during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Scholars from Oxford's electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature have translated it in full. And what it says, line by line, and image by image, will not leave you easily. Picture the temple complex of Ur at its height. It is the 21st century BCE. The ziggurat rises from the flat plains of Mesopotamia, like a stepped mountain reaching toward a sky full of gods. Priests move through incense smoke in the pre-dawn dark. The city below is alive with commerce, with music, with the smell of bread baking in clay ovens and bitumen sealing wooden boats. The population of Ur at this time is estimated to have been somewhere between 65,000 and 80,000 people. Extraordinary for the ancient world. This is a civilization that invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. A civilization that mapped the stars and named the planets. A civilization that, by any reasonable measure, should not have disappeared. And yet, within a generation, it did. And what the Lament records in the final chapters of that story is not the arrival of armies. It is something else. Something that the scribes struggled to describe. Something that starts with the gods turning their faces away. The actual text of the Lament, preserved across multiple tablet fragments, cross-referenced by scholars and verified beyond academic dispute, contains passages that read like this. "O my Nana, the goddess cries to the moon god, yea, do not exert yourself in vain. Abandon your city." And Nana listens, and Nana goes. And that line is not an isolated moment. It repeats. Across the 5 great city laments of ancient Sumer, the laments for Ur, for Nippur, for Aridu, for Sumer and Ur combined, for the Akur temple. The same act is described again and again. The gods gather. The gods debate. The great council assembles. And then, one by one, they abandon their temples, their cities, and their people. The question the text never answers, the question that the scribe clearly burned with, is why? Why did they go? What was calling them away? What could possibly be more important than the civilization they had spent thousands of years constructing? Some researchers believe the answer might be hiding in plain sight, buried not in the farewell itself, but in what the gods took with them when they left. Yeah, this is where the investigation deepens into territory that mainstream history rarely wants to visit. Because the Sumerian texts are not just laments and king lists. They form an interconnected library, a cosmological system that describes who the Anunnaki actually were, why they came to Earth, and what their ultimate purpose was here. And when you read that system as a whole, when you lay the Atrahasis epic alongside the Enuma Elish, alongside the king list, alongside the lament, a picture emerges that is deeply, persistently unsettling. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most carefully studied texts in Mesopotamian scholarship, describes the Anunnaki as beings who arrived on Earth and put the lower gods, called the Igigi, to work in labor. The labor is described in extraordinary detail. Digging, excavating, quarrying. And then, when the Igigi rebelled, when they threw down their tools and refused to continue, the Anunnaki's chief scientist, a figure called Enki, or Ea, proposed a solution. He would create a primitive worker, a being of lesser intelligence but capable hands. A being made, in the text's own extraordinary phrase, in the image of the gods. And the purpose of this being was explicit. It was to take over the work the Igigi refused to do. Could it be that the work described in the Atrahasis is not mythological at all? Could it be that what the ancient Sumerians called labor, what they described as digging and quarrying on a massive scale, points to an operation that had a very specific material purpose? Because there is one detail in the text that researchers keep returning to. One detail that appears not once, not twice, but with remarkable consistency across multiple Sumerian and Akkadian sources. And that detail is gold. What if the entire framework of Sumerian civilization, the cities, the temples, the writing, the astronomical records, the intricate bureaucracy, was never primarily meant to serve humanity at all? What if it was infrastructure? What if the Anunnaki built the world's first civilization the way you build a processing plant? Efficient, organized, and ultimately temporary. Consider what happens when you read the Sumerian texts not as mythology, but as corporate records. Thus, the Anunnaki are described as arriving from the sky in a council formation. They establish headquarters, they assign roles, they appoint administrators, human kings. With a specific job title the texts call En, meaning something close to lord or steward. These kings are not described as sovereign rulers in the modern sense. They are described as managers, intermediaries between the human workforce and the Anunnaki overseers. The great god Enlil, headquartered at Nippur, he sits at the top of the hierarchy. Beneath him, regional directors, Enki in Aridu, Nana in Inanna in Uruk. Each city is not merely a city. Each city is described as an estate, an assignment, a domain with a specific purpose. And each estate runs with a precision that modern supply chain managers would recognize immediately. Now, here's what makes that framing truly bizarre. The Sumerian word for the divine laws, the organizing principles that govern all of civilization, is the word me. The me are described in the texts as physical objects, not abstract laws. Physical things that can be stolen, transferred, held, possessed. And they include a remarkable inventory: kingship, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the scribal art, the art of building, the art of music, wisdom, truth, the descent of fire, the extinguishing of fire, over 100 specific capabilities, all encoded in objects that the gods carry with them, transfer between themselves, and guard jealously. What are the me exactly? The texts never clarify. They simply insist that whoever holds the me holds power over civilization itself. Is it possible that the me were not mystical at all? Is it possible they were something far more literal? Technology? Knowledge systems? Encoded information stored in physical devices? And if they were, then when the gods left, and the texts say quite clearly that the gods took their me with them, what, precisely, departed with them from the temples of Sumer? Fast forward to around 2004 BCE. The third dynasty of Ur, the last great flowering of Sumerian civilization, is collapsing. Scholars cite the Elamite invasions. They cite climate change, soil salinization from over-irrigated fields, economic strain. All real factors, all documented. But here is what the official academic narrative tends to gloss over. The collapse was not gradual. It was catastrophic. Cities that had functioned continuously for over 2,000 years emptied within a generation. The administrative records, the meticulous, obsessive Sumerian bureaucratic records that tracked every jar of oil, every ration of grain, every labor assignment, simply stop. Not gradually, abruptly, like someone turning off a light. And in the last tablets from the city of Ur do not trail off into increasingly desperate notes. They stop, full stop, mid-accounting, as if the scribes put down their styli, walked out of the buildings, and never came back. Not one subsequent tablet was found in the relevant administrative archives. Something happened that did not allow for an orderly conclusion. And the question that lingers in that silence is, what did those last scribes know that made them stop writing? Because there is one final administrative text from the end of the Ur III period that a small number of researchers find extraordinarily significant. A text not from Ur itself, but from Nippur, the sacred city at the center of the Sumerian world, the city where Enlil's great temple, the Ekur, stood. It is an accounting text, the most mundane possible type of document. And yet what it records in its final lines is not grain. Not labor hours, not cattle. It records a transfer, a movement of temple property, including objects described by the same terms used elsewhere for the sacred me, out of the Akur. The transfer is authorized by temple officials. The destination is listed simply as the sky. The sky. Now, mainstream scholars argue this is a religious formulation, a way of saying the objects were consecrated, sent to the gods symbolically. That is the conventional interpretation. But what if it wasn't symbolic? What if the scribes of Nippur were writing what may have been among the last bureaucratic records of their civilization? Were recording something they actually witnessed? Objects carried from the greatest temple in the Sumerian world, loaded onto something and taken upward? At some researchers, and here it is important to be clear that these interpretations live outside the mainstream consensus, have spent decades examining a specific cluster of late Sumerian and early Babylonian texts that describe what they call the withdrawal. This is not a widely used academic term, but it describes something that the texts themselves return to repeatedly. A sequence of events in which the Anunnaki, in a coordinated and apparently planned manner, began pulling back from direct involvement with human civilization. Not all at once, over generations, hundreds of years, but systematically, deliberately, the way a tenant vacates a property before the lease expires. The Curse of Agade is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing document in this sequence. Composed to describe the fall of the empire of Naram-Sin, who reigned from 2254 to 2218 BCE. It records an event that scholars have largely treated as metaphor. The great god Enlil, enraged by Naram-Sin's desecration of the Akur temple, does not punish the king directly. He removes himself. He takes his divine protection away from the city of Agade. And then, one by one, all the other great gods follow his lead. The text describes them turning their backs, abandoning their temples, withdrawing their presence. And then the text describes what happened to a city once the gods were gone. The crops failed, the canals dried, the roads emptied, the armies came. And all of it, every catastrophe, every collapse, is described not as a natural disaster, not as political failure, but as the consequence of absence, of divine withdrawal. What if the Sumerians were not using metaphor at all? And what if every time they wrote about gods abandoning cities, which they did across 5 separate lament texts, spanning several centuries, they were writing about something they genuinely experienced? What if absence was the catastrophe? And now consider the timing. The Curse of Agade describes events around 2200 BCE. The Lament for Sumer and Ur describes events around 2004 BCE. The other city laments cluster around the same period. Within roughly 200 years, every major god in the Sumerian pantheon is described, in contemporaneous texts, as having abandoned their city, as having left. Is it possible that what appeared to the Sumerians as a series of divine withdrawals was, in fact, a single coordinated departure? A staged disengagement from a civilization that had served its purpose? And if so, whose purpose? Here is the detail that some researchers find most troubling of all. That the Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as being destroyed, defeated, or overwhelmed. The gods are not killed in battle. They are not driven out. They are not overthrown by human rebellion. They choose to leave. They deliberate. They debate. They argue among themselves. Enlil wants to destroy humanity. Enki wants to protect it. And they reach some kind of compromise that neither the texts nor the scholars have ever fully decoded. But they leave, together, voluntarily. And before they go, a number of texts describe something that sounds, when you read it slowly, less like a religious blessing and more like a closing statement. A terminal handover. In the Lament for Sumer and Ur, the goddess Ningal, mother figure, protector of the city, goes before the divine council and pleads for the survival of her people. She argues. She is moved. She weeps. And then she is overruled. And what she says to her city before she leaves is one of the most haunting passages in all of ancient literature. Truly I wept before Anu. Truly I mourned before Enlil. But An did not alter his decision. Enlil did not soothe my heart. Read that again. Not the gods were absent in some vague spiritual sense. Not the gods were displeased. She went before them in person. She argued in a council chamber. She lost the vote. And then she left. What kind of mythology requires a voting council for divine departure? What kind of religious metaphor specifies that the dissenting goddess wept specifically before two named senior officials? This reads less like theology and more like meeting minutes. Minutes from a meeting that ended a civilization. Consider now what the Anunnaki were, or rather, what the Sumerians consistently described them as being. The name itself, in its most common Sumerian interpretation, means something close to those who came from heaven to earth, or princely offspring of the sky. Not born of the earth, descended to it. In text after text, the Anunnaki are depicted as arriving from elsewhere. They establish a base of operations at Aridu. They expand outward. They build a network of cities, each with its own function, its own overseer, its own assigned production. And they interact with humanity not as distant cosmic forces, but as present, physical, are hierarchical beings who eat, who argue, who get drunk at banquets, who make decisions they later regret, and who, crucially, age differently from humans, or perhaps do not age at all. The Sumerian king list records their reigns in tens of thousands of years, not symbolically. In the same numerical system used to count sheep, to measure grain, to calculate the orbits of planets. What if the Anunnaki's departure was not abandonment, but relocation? Yes, what if the civilization they built on Earth was always meant to be temporary? A mining operation, a colony, a research station. And when the operation concluded, they simply transferred their assets, packed their me, and moved on. What remains behind in that scenario? Exactly what we find. Cities in ruins, texts full of grief, human descendants who remember gods but cannot find them, and a burning generational question encoded in every clay tablet, every prayer, as every lamentation. Where did they go, and will they come back? There is a man who spent his entire career asking precisely that question. His name was Zechariah Sitchin, born in 1920, died in 2010. He was an Azerbaijani-American scholar who dedicated decades to reading the Sumerian texts in their original Cuneiform and proposing an interpretation that the academic establishment has never fully forgiven him for. Sitchin argued, in a series of books beginning with the 12th Planet, published in 1976, that the Anunnaki were not gods in any spiritual sense. They were a technologically advanced species from a planet in our own solar system, a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, and their presence on Earth, their creation of humanity, their eventual departure, all of it, Sitchin argued, was recorded faithfully and literally in the Sumerian texts, are obscured only by our modern reluctance to take ancient people at their word. Now, mainstream scholars reject Sitchin's interpretation comprehensively. His translations have been disputed. His astronomical claims about Nibiru have been debunked by planetary scientists. And it is important to be absolutely clear. His theories are not accepted by the academic consensus. But here is the question that even Sitchin's critics struggle to answer cleanly. If the Sumerian texts are pure mythology, why are they so consistent? Why do 5 separate lament texts, written across multiple centuries by different scribes in different cities, all describe the same sequence of events? God's convening, God's deliberating, God's leaving, with the same level of administrative specificity? What does it mean that the most emotionally devastating literature of the ancient world is not about human tragedy, but about divine departure? Could it be that the mystery does not lie in choosing between Sitchin and the mainstream? Could it be that both are looking at the same shadow, cast by something neither of them can quite name? Now here's what makes the lament for Sumer and uniquely disturbing, as opposed to simply sad. It is not written in the past tense, it is written in the present. The scribe does not say, "The gods abandoned the city." The scribe writes as if the abandonment is happening now, yet in the moment of composition, as if the scribe is watching it in real time. Picture the scribe's room: stone floor, oil lamp guttering in a clay bowl, the smell of river mud and smoke drifting through the window slit of a dying city. The scribe's hands are steady. They have been trained since childhood to keep their hands steady. But outside, the streets are emptying in a way that has no precedent. There is no army at the gates yet. The walls are intact. The granaries still hold food. Yes, nothing external has changed. And yet something is wrong in the temples. Something the priests are not explaining. The great processional ways are empty. The inner sanctuaries are dark. And the scribe writes, with agonizing precision, what the god Nana is being told before his departure. Is about to be destroyed. Its fate cannot be altered. Will go to waste. Not might be destroyed. Not is being threatened, is about to be destroyed, as if someone with foreknowledge of what is coming is issuing a final notice. A termination announcement. Is it possible that what sounds to us like religious predestination was, to the scribes of a very literal statement? That beings who possessed information about the future, or who controlled the forces that would determine it, were informing the human administrative staff that their assignment was ending? That the city had been flagged for discontinuation? Let's step back for a moment and look at the architecture of this mystery. Because there are several layers here that don't quite connect in ways that should be comfortable. Layer 1 is historical. Sumerian civilization, the world's first, did collapse around 2004 BCE. That is established fact. Layer 2 is textual. The Sumerians themselves, in contemporaneous documents, attributed that collapse to the departure of divine beings who had previously sustained and organized their civilization. That is documented in the clay tablets. Layer 3 is the question of interpretation. Were those divine beings metaphorical representations of natural and political forces? Or were they, as some researchers insist, something else entirely? And Layer 4, the layer that is almost never discussed in academic literature, is the question of what they left behind, and whether any of it is still here. Because the Sumerian texts describe the me, those divine objects, those encoded power packages, as things that can be possessed by humans, transferred, stolen, and held. And the texts record that certain human kings received specific me from the gods before or during the withdrawal. Gilgamesh, the most famous of all Sumerian heroes, was said to possess knowledge obtained from the gods directly. On he traveled. The Epic of Gilgamesh is extraordinarily specific about this, to a distant place where divine beings still resided and returned with information. His failure to return with immortality is the famous tragedy of the story. But what he did return with, what the text hints at but never fully reveals, might be more important. He returned with knowledge, specific knowledge. Knowledge the gods gave him because perhaps, they were leaving and wanted to ensure some record of it survived. What was that record? What knowledge was so important it needed to be hidden in the coded symbolism of the world's first written story? No one knows. And the fact that no one knows should disturb every one of us who lives in a civilization that can trace its intellectual inheritance, however indirectly, back to the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. There is one more text that deserves your full attention. Now, it is one of the least widely publicized documents in the Sumerian corpus, and perhaps the most chilling once you understand what it describes. It comes from the final administrative period of the Nippur temple complex. Nippur, the sacred city, the city of Enlil, the spiritual headquarters of all Sumer, was not a military city. It had no defensive walls of any significance. It was defended by something else. By the presence of Enlil himself, who the texts describe as so fearsome in divine power that no enemy king dared attack his city. And yet, at the very end, Nippur fell. The records stop. The temple was stripped and abandoned. And what one fragmentary tablet from that final period records, a tablet that has been studied, translated, and largely set aside as an anomaly, is a temple inventory, a final accounting of what the Eker contained. And the inventory ends with a passage that scholars translate with notable discomfort, as something like this. The house of the great mountain, the Eker, has been made empty. Its divine objects have been taken to the sky. Its Lord has turned his face away and gone to a distant place, which is not known. A distant place, which is not known, not heaven in any theological sense, not death, not sleep, not cosmic transcendence. A distant place which is not known. A location, a destination, a direction that the scribe admits he cannot identify. Think about what that means. Just the people who knew Enlil, who served in his temple, who received his directives, who watched his priests perform the daily rituals that maintained his presence. Those people recorded that he left for somewhere specific, somewhere real enough to be described as a location, somewhere specific enough that its absence from the known world needed to be noted. Not, Enlil returned to the heavens, which is the standard religious phrasing throughout Mesopotamian literature. He went to a distant place which is not known. That is not theology, that is geography. And it is the last recorded reference to the most powerful figure in the Sumerian divine hierarchy before the lights went out entirely. Now consider what the Sumerians themselves believed would happen next. Because here is something that virtually no documentary or pop history summary of the Anunnaki story mentions. The departure was not described as permanent. The city laments, despite their devastating grief, contained within them a thread of anticipation, a conviction, stated in the texts not as hope but as fact, that the gods would return, not as a resurrection myth, not as an afterlife promise, as a literal scheduled return. Some researchers who have studied the astronomical dimensions of Sumerian record-keeping note that the Sumerians tracked celestial cycles with a precision that served no purely agricultural purpose. They calculated cycles of thousands of years, and as they named specific astronomical periods that would take generations of human lifetimes to observe. And some of those cycles, the researchers are careful here, because the evidence is fragmentary, appear to correlate with the timescales mentioned in connection with the god's return. As if someone left behind a clock, a very large, very slow clock. And the Sumerians, faithful, bewildered, recording everything they had been taught, kept winding it. What if the grief in the Lament for Sumer and is not only grief over what was lost, but grief over the gap? The unimaginable gap between departure and return? What if every prayer, every temple rite, every astronomical calculation performed by every Sumerian priest after the withdrawal was not worship in the conventional sense, but maintenance? Keeping the lights on for someone who said they'd be back? let's talk about what cannot be explained. Because one of the most curious features of the Sumerian collapse, a feature that nobody has satisfactorily accounted for, is the simultaneous disappearance of specific technical knowledge. Not just the political structures, not just the administrative systems, but specific skills, specific capabilities that simply vanished from the archaeological record at the same moment the texts say the gods left. The construction techniques for the great ziggurats, for example, are temples built with a precision that still impresses modern engineers. Massive mud brick structures with precisely calculated angles, drainage systems, spatial orientations aligned to astronomical bodies. The knowledge to build them did not gradually deteriorate. It stopped. The later cities built in Mesopotamia after the Sumerian collapse are competent, sometimes impressive, but they do not reproduce the specific technical characteristics of the great Ur-3 structures, as if the architects forgot something, or as if they no longer had access to whatever reference they had previously been consulting. The astronomical records offer a similar pattern. Sumerian astronomy was extraordinary. They tracked the movements of the planets across multiple generations with an accuracy that required either very sophisticated instrumentation or very long-term coordinated observation. And then that tradition was interrupted, not destroyed. The Babylonians who came later preserved fragments of it, built on it. But the foundational raw data, the original observations, stretching back into the deep prehistorical periods, those vanish. There is a gap in the observational record that corresponds almost exactly to the collapse period. Is it possible that the most advanced observational data wasn't stored in tablets at all? Is it possible it was stored in the me? In those physical objects the texts say were taken when the gods departed? And if so, then what departed from the Uruk of Nippur on the day the last inventory was compiled was not just religious artifacts. It was the intellectual inheritance of the human race, in the hands of the beings who provided it, and who apparently decided to take it back. Here is the layer of this story that should keep you up at night. And it is not a theory, it is a question that emerges directly from the texts themselves, without any need for ancient astronaut interpretation or fringe scholarship. The question is this: if the Anunnaki created humanity, as the texts explicitly state, and if they built civilization, as the texts explicitly demonstrate, and if they then departed on their own schedule, taking with them the knowledge and tools that had sustained that civilization, then what is our relationship to that event right now? Because we live inside the tradition those Sumerians began. Our mathematics, our astronomy, our legal systems, our concepts of justice and kingship and cosmic order, all of them trace back, directly and demonstrably, to that valley between the Tigris and Euphrates. The story the Sumerians recorded is not ancient in the way Egyptian tomb paintings are ancient. It is foundational. It is the ground we stand on. And that ground contains, at its deepest layer, as a record of a departure that was never explained, by beings whose nature was never fully defined, at a moment that no one has ever satisfactorily accounted for. Something happened in Sumer around 4,000 years ago that the people who lived through it found so catastrophic, so total, so final, that they composed 5 separate extended poems to mourn it. Not one poem, 5, in multiple cities, by multiple scribes, over multiple generations. Whilst the grief was so vast, it needed 5 monuments to contain it. What do you build a monument that large to? What did they lose that required that much language to describe? 5 sets of lament texts, hundreds of lines each, all saying the same thing in different forms. The gods are gone, the city is empty, the protection is withdrawn, and we do not know if it is permanent. We do not know if they are ever coming back. Consider the archaeology of the great Sumerian temple complexes in their final phase. When excavators from the University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum began uncovering the ruins of Uruk and Nippur in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, digging through meters of accumulated debris, pulling tablets from the clay, they noted something unusual about the final occupation layers of the major temples. The rooms were clean, deliberately and systematically emptied, not ransacked, not burned chaotically in the way buildings burn when armies come through. Organized. The portable objects were removed. The fixed structures remained. The walls stood. But the inner sanctuaries were bare in a way that suggests careful, intentional clearance rather than plunder. Some scholars noted that the same pattern appeared across multiple sites simultaneously, not staggered in the way you would expect from a series of raids or lootings, but coordinated, as if the stripping of the temples was a single operation, conducted across the breadth of Sumer at roughly the same time. Is it possible that the invading Elamites did not empty the Sumerian temples? Is it possible the temples were already empty when they arrived? And if so, who emptied them? And where did the contents go? There are those who spend their careers deep in the Sumerian literature who will tell you, quietly, in the margins of academic conferences, that the city laments are the strangest texts they have ever read. Not because they are obscure. They are extraordinarily well preserved. Not because they are ambiguous. They are remarkably clear. The language is direct. The imagery is concrete. The emotions are fully human and fully comprehensible. What makes them strange is their combination of specificity and scale. Yet they describe the end of the world, the complete and total collapse of a civilization that had defined the known world for 3,000 years. With the clinical precision of a final quarterly report. Gods assigned to specific cities, check-in procedures before departure, arguments in council chambers, weeping by the dissenting member, transfer of divine objects, issuance of final commands. The city turned over to lesser management, the Elamites, the Amorites, whoever the next tenants might be, and then nothing. Silence. The stylus set down, the clay left to dry, the lamp extinguished. What do you do with a record like that? What do you do with a civilization that kept such meticulous accounts of its own end? The Sumerians did not scramble in chaos. They wrote it down, they preserved it, they composed poetry about it because they understood, on some level, that the information mattered. That future people like us, that people sitting in the unimaginable future they could not conceive, might one day read what happened and need to understand it. But understand what, exactly? That the gods were metaphors for natural forces? That the departure was a literary device for political collapse? Or that beings of extraordinary capability spent thousands of years in this valley building something, and when they were done building it, yes, they said goodbye in language the scribes strained to record faithfully, and left for a distant place which is not known. So what are we left with? 4,000 years of silence. Ruins in the Iraqi desert, half submerged in sand, accessible only through the lens of wartime and geopolitical conflict that has kept archaeologists from properly excavating them for decades. A clay library of extraordinary depth and complexity, as most of it still untranslated. Hundreds of thousands of tablets still sitting in museum storage, in university archives, in the storerooms of institutions that have not had the resources to process them. Each of those tablets might contain another fragment of the accounting, another line of the inventory, another portion of whatever conversation happened in the council of the great gods before the decision to leave was finalized. We do not know what those untranslated tablets say. We have never known. And the question of what they might contain, what further descriptions, what further specifics, what final messages is not merely academic. It is the question of our own origins, of who built the world we inherited and why, and whether they left a forwarding address. The official story, the comfortable story, says Sumerian civilization collapsed for understandable reasons. Climate, conquest, economics, soil degradation. And all of those factors are real and documented. But the people who lived through it, the people who were there, told a different story. They said the gods left first. They said the gods left by choice. They said the gods held a meeting and made a decision and said their goodbyes and departed for somewhere specific, and took with them the objects that had made civilization possible, and that the invasions and the droughts and the salinization followed as a consequence of that departure, not a cause. They said the absence was the catastrophe. And they said it in 5 separate texts across multiple centuries, in the most carefully preserved clay in the ancient world, as if they needed the future to hear it. Were they right? Was there a council? Was there a departure? Is there something in those untranslated tablets that would change what we know about ourselves? Or is it all, as the mainstream insists, an elaborate and haunting metaphor for forces that have no face? The honest answer is, we do not know. And perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. Not that the Anunnaki were gods, or aliens, or ancient rulers with extraordinary technology, but that we have their library, incomplete, fragmented, and largely unread, and we do not yet know what it says. What do you think really happened in those final days in the temples of Sumer? What do you think the last scribe heard in the silence of the Ikur before the lamp went out? Let me know in the comments. Some of you will have answers that might surprise the rest of us, because the greatest mysteries are not the ones buried in the sand. They are the ones encoded in language we have, but have not yet fully read. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again, stay curious.